So ready or not, what will you do with your grief? Ready or not, what will you do with your story, your mess? Will it become your message or will it become your identity? Both are choices. And I would encourage everybody to use your choice wisely, ready or not. How will you grieve?
Get your daily dose of motivation on the Motivational Moments with Michelle podcast. In Motivation with Michelle podcast, you'll get encouraging, uplifting, and life-changing wisdom that will transform your world at your fingertips, 24-hour a day. Get a fuller, deeper revelation of the tools you can implement to see incredible transformation in your life from Michelle Neustadter's powerful teachings. Tune in whenever you need to be edified, uplifted, or a dose of motivation, no matter where you are. Subscribe to Motivational Moments with Michelle podcast with Michelle Neustadter today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SoundCloud.
So my story is 10 years ago that we lost a 2-month-old to the day.
Goodness.
Yeah, he was born June 4th and passed away August 4th.
Oh my goodness. That makes it so much harder in many ways. I mean, not that one loss is better than the next, but I thought you were talking about a miscarriage.
No.
But to lose a child at 2 months old, that's wow. I may flip this around today and I may want to just sort of pull from you because there's very real threats to stuff like this. Even I know you know this already from a professional point of view, and it's hard when the professional meets the personal, and we're talking about Michelle's journey. But I mean, how do you insulate from that becoming an identity hit? Something like, I am she who has lost a child, versus you being so much more. Like, think about how people grieve, think about it'll probably end up coming up, but the very linear way that people present the stages of grief and how that doesn't actually work in many people. Like we flip-flop back and forth between all these different stages and hopefully move towards acceptance. But then what? And there's lots of different places this can go today. So I'm curious, your own grieving process, like 10 years. So that means you were in the line of work that you were in right now. So I'm very curious, like, how did you process that? How much of the pain did you let in? How much, if you were being objective, do you realize you've still carried, if any? And like, how did you navigate that?
I liked the very first question you asked about how do you insulate yourself and not necessarily become your grief, because I think that is really critical. And as I've been going through these discussions recently around theories of counseling and practice and whatnot, I've really come to recognize the power of the narrative frame and how important our language is and the stories that we tell ourselves. The story, however that might look, and we all do it. We're all storytellers, right? Like, think about any time that you're talking about anything, you're telling a story, right? We are all storytellers. Our entire life, our history, who we are, how we are, who we are, is all a story for us. And when we go through something really big, that becomes part of that story. However, when it's like a trauma doesn't integrate well, right? So it can become who we are, as opposed to part of that story, as a part of who I am, not the entirety of who I am.
Right.
And I think for me, that was one of the critical kind of pieces that moved me through that space, was how I chose to view it, or the way we tell the story, right? So that in the languaging that I that I take for myself rather than focus on this being who I am. The story is shifted and this becomes maybe a chapter within the story. And it's a part of why I am who I am. It's a part of how I view, say, some of maybe the compassion and empathy that I experience with people. But it's not the entirety of who I am. And I think a lot of times that can be a really hard transition for people to make. And as I said, like, this can be true of like any loss that we experience, but a lot, especially when it is loss of a child in any way, shape, or form, whether it's a child it can even be miscarriage. It can be as early as a miscarriage. It can be as late as, your child having lived 30 or 40 years of their life. And yet the definition of self in relation can get muddled. Self in relation to the loss, right? We spend so much of our time defining ourselves by those different rules that we have. So,
right.
Michelle as mom,
right?
Michelle as therapist, Michelle as, right? And so then when those things get taken away, we can lose a part of that definition of self.
We remember. How do we celebrate a life? I love how you said it's a part of me, but it's not all of me. There's this idea that identity doesn't have to be rooted in history. As we look back and we gain this vantage of hindsight, what have you been able to learn? What patterns have you uncovered because of this loss that you wisely were able to navigate and did not let it define you? It's a part of you, but it's not who you are. What other patterns have you noticed because of this?
It was one of the probably most critical things that really actually moved me through that space, like right in the early moments of that space. And, we read scriptures like, we don't have to grieve the way the world grieves, but it really becomes identifiable, apparent. It becomes really real in those moments when you're actually moving through that space and you understand really like what that truly means, the depth of what that really means. That we don't have to grieve the way the world grieves because we have a hope. And like I said, it became kind of one of those pieces that really came alive in me during that space, because not only was like that scripture made very real, but also Romans 8:28, where it says that he uses all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so for me, that scripture was written across the whiteboard in my kitchen for a long, long time. It became kind of like my go-to, like, I need to remember this every single day, that he uses all things for the good of those who love him. All things. That's not just the good things that happen in our lives, but it's also the challenges that we walk through. And I had a couple of other ones that were written on my board, but that one was like my big, like, okay, faith is what's moving me through this space. And knowing that I have this hope, and knowing that I have this purpose, and knowing that I would never be given something that I can't navigate through.
Yeah.
And that his strength is my strength, right? Like,
that's it.
When I am weak, he is strong.
Again, go back to what we were saying at the very beginning. Listen to the messaging, the narrative. Look at what you guys were able to do in the middle of something so heart-wrenching. And I'm hoping that everybody that's listening can, in a way, try to walk in Michelle's shoes, try to understand what it would take for, in the middle of the storm, to be able to define what that storm, or limit what that storm can produce in your life. Her and her husband made a decision. We're not letting this rock us. They couldn't control the loss, but they could control the result. And the result and the impact on the other relationships that they had. Michelle could have let this affect her ability to parent her other children. She could have stopped having children at that point. There's all kinds of decisions she could have made, but she didn't let it define her, and she walked through the storm. So I'm hoping everybody that's listening can draw strength from this and figure out what lines you need to make in the sand of your own storms when you guys are walking through them. What are you saying about yourself? How do we start to redesign or redefine the impact these storms have on us? And like Michelle's doing, be able to set certain non-negotiables. And her marriage was one of them. It wouldn't take her marriage. Thank you for sharing that, Michelle.
And I have been, like, as you were just talking there, I'm sitting back and I'm thinking about exactly what you're saying and reflecting a bit around this idea of these non-negotiables. Because I think in the middle of a storm, we don't necessarily think about those pieces. We don't,
No.
like, we're just, we have this almost war that's waging around us. And in the middle of that, we're kind of letting life happen to us. Whereas when we start to set some of those lines in the sand, when we set some of those non-negotiables right there in that moment, it changes how we move through that space, because life is no longer happening to me. Now in that space, I've got some semblance of say, control, direction, because I've decided. Whatever the storm might be that somebody's navigating through, whether it's like financial difficulties or challenges in your marriage or difficulty or loss or whatever the storm might look like, we can, in those moments, draw some lines in the sand and say, this is how this is going to go. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is how it's going to go. And I create a narrative for myself that gives me direction. It gives me action. And I've always said, actually, action reduces emotion. So like when we've got an action plan and we've got something that we're moving towards, that level of emotion we're experiencing comes down in that space. So when grief, right, some of those anxieties or fears or pains, now that's not to say that they go away.
No.
I can tell you they don't. But I've made a decision that I'm going to navigate through things differently. And there's probably other areas in that storm that I needed to set more non-negotiables that I didn't even know that I needed to set. Because now when I reflect on it, I think about my husband and I. Yes, you're right. We could have decided to end our, we're not having any more kids, but we didn't. In fact, we started trying again fairly soon thereafter for another child. However, when he was born, there was a lot of fear that sat there. And so there was more areas where maybe other non-negotiables had needed to be set, that I wouldn't let what happened to me dictate how I navigated this next life, which I did with my child after that one. So my youngest, where we actually decided, we weren't sure how many kids we had wanted to have. And after Eli, my second youngest, was, 2-ish, we were like, let's have one more. And part of the decision-making process in having one more was I wanted to do one without fear. Yeah. That's how I sort of said, I walked through, how I felt that I had moved through that space. Because a lot of people asked me what that was like for me. And I said, of course there was pain, but I really, truly, coming out the other side, felt as though in the grand scheme of loss and pain and challenge, I felt like I moved through that relatively unscathed, despite still having had lots of emotions. Absolutely. In the course of that.
The other side of that is it could have been a lot worse. Think about an unhealthy mindset going through that. You didn't, again, we get the benefit of looking back, but without those coping skills, without the supports that you had, without your faith, imagine trying to go through that storm without the things that got you through the storm. We could be talking about something that would have had a very different impact on you and potentially was a bitter root that's been persisting for years. And we probably wouldn't even be talking about it because it's no, we're not going there. So again, it's amazing that it all does seem to come back to choice. You made choices. You could have made different choices. What could you have done in the absence of the supports that you have?